So, Camilla Parker BS just had her entire royal future locked away in a black archival case. And the person who walked into the room and made it final wasn't some dusty old lawyer or even King Charles himself. It was Princess Anne, with Kate Middleton's name woven so deeply into the legal documents that it became instantly clear this wasn't about furniture or floor plans. This was about making sure one woman's ambition could never ever displace the direct line of succession. And honestly, once you see the timeline of how this all started, the fact that it ended with Camilla being told she's essentially a high-ranking guest in every single palace she thought she'd conquered is the least surprising part. Before we get into the actual dinner that lit the fuse on this entire situation, do me a quick favor and hit subscribe to our channel so you don't miss when we break down stuff like this, because the details here are genuinely wild. Okay, so the moment that really breaks this open happens at a private meeting room at Windsor Castle. Camilla is sitting there already reeling because a private secretary just read aloud the contents of a sealed decree that Prince Philip left behind, and the words are basically a constitutional eviction notice. We're not talking about a minor domestic squabble over who gets which guest wing. The decree explicitly states that as a consort who sits outside the direct bloodline of succession, Camilla cannot claim permanent private quarters, independent household authority, or administrative control inside any principal crown residence. Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, Balmoral, Sandringham, every single one of them placed beyond her reach, not temporarily, permanently. She can visit when duty requires it. She could attend ceremonies, but she could never appoint staff to those spaces. She could never redesign the private quarters to her taste, and she could never treat those walls as her own home. The doors haven't just closed, they've been deliberately locked. And the keys are being held by people who are not her husband. Now, what makes this so much bigger than a family argument is the legal machinery behind it. A lot of people assume that if you marry the king, you automatically get to live in the palaces and run your own household within them. But crown residences aren't private property. They're held in trust for the institution itself, for the continuity of the monarchy across generations. A reigning monarch can't just hand over apartments or administrative authority to his spouse out of personal affection. The properties belong to something much larger than any single reign, and Prince Philip understood that distinction better than almost anyone. So when he drafted this decree, he wasn't just being difficult or protective of tradition in some abstract way. He was creating an immovable legal wall between Camilla and the physical centers of royal power, and he did it knowing full well that someday his own son would be the one forced to enforce it. The psychological weight of that moment is almost impossible to overstate. Camilla spent 50 years navigating public hostility, tabloid cruelty, and the long shadow of Princess Diana to reach the absolute pinnacle of the institution. She endured being called every name imaginable, waded through decades of scandal, and finally stood beside Charles at his coronation as queen. And yet in a single afternoon, a private secretary reading from a dead man's papers informed her that her status inside the palaces she thought she had finally earned is functionally equivalent to a distinguished visitor who must always ask permission to belong. You can see it in the way she pulls the papers toward herself, demanding to read the words with her own eyes. You can hear it in the question she asks that hangs in the air unanswered. How long had Charles known this was coming? The king's silence in that moment tells you everything. He can't rescue her. Even as sovereign, he's bound by the conditions his father left behind, and challenging them would mean declaring open war on the senior royal trustees and the legal guardians empowered to enforce the decree. Love and duty are in direct conflict, and for the first time in his reign, duty is winning with absolute finality. But to really understand why Philip went to such extreme lengths, you have to go back to the night this all started. Because the decree wasn't born from some abstract philosophical concern about constitutional governance. It was born at a private family dinner at Windsor Castle that went so badly off the rails that Philip walked away convinced Camilla posed an active threat to the future of the monarchy. Up until that evening, Philip had largely accepted Camilla as the long-suffering partner of his eldest son. He'd watched the drama play out for half a century and had made his peace with her presence as an inevitable reality of Charles's life and eventual reign. But that dinner changed everything. Months before this gathering, the palace administration had begun quiet discussions about succession planning. Not the ceremonial stuff the public sees, but the deeply unglamorous work of figuring out who would control which apartments, which administrative offices, which guest wings, and which household staff once the transition from one reign to the next began in earnest. These meetings might sound like boring real estate logistics, but they're actually about power. Whoever controls the private rooms surrounding a monarch controls access. They control who gets a quiet word before a decision is made, which staff members are promoted, which family members have the ear of the sovereign, and which heirs are either empowered or quietly sidelined. Philip knew this with absolute clarity. At the dinner, a senior official presented a proposal that explicitly reserved a major historic apartment suite within Windsor Castle for Prince William, Princess Catherine, and their young children. The logic was straightforward. As the direct heirs, they needed secure, permanent residential footing within the principal royal residences to prepare for their expanded constitutional roles. Before anyone else at the table could even process the strategic significance, Camilla challenged it directly. She argued that the reservation was premature, that the next sovereign should have the freedom to decide such domestic matters after Charles had fully assumed the throne, and that Charles had already sacrificed enough personal happiness as life without being shackled by preemptive arrangements engineered by the previous generation. She framed it as fierce loyalty to her husband, as protecting him from bureaucratic overreach. But the words landed with a chilling effect across that mahogany table. Philip sat down his glass with a deliberate slowness that made the whole room go cold. He leaned forward and asked a single question that cut straight through every diplomatic layer. Did she genuinely consider the direct heirs to the throne to be mere guests inside their own ancestral inheritance? The silence that followed was crushing. Camilla tried to defend her position, insisting again that Charles deserved total domestic autonomy after decades of suffering. But against the towering wall of institutional continuity that Philip represented, her words sounded hollow. And then something happened that I think gets overlooked in a lot of retellings of this story, but actually explains so much of what came later. Princess Catherine, who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire exchange, slowly moved her chair just a fraction of an inch away from the table. It was a tiny, almost involuntary physical reaction, but it carried immense psychological weight. She had just heard the foundational home of her children's future reduced to disposable political territory being bartered away by a royal consort. Prince William noticed immediately. He glanced at Catherine and lowered his gaze to the polished table surface, deliberately suppressing his anger to prevent the dinner from exploding into an open confrontation between his father's new marriage and his own young family's absolute security. That tiny, almost imperceptible glance between William and Catherine was the exact moment Philip realized the dispute was no longer about bedrooms or floor plans. It was a fundamental battle over whether the physical and administrative security of the next generation of direct heirs could ever be made dangerously dependent on the personal approval whims or changing moods of a consort who sat outside the direct bloodline. Later that same night, driven by an urgency that superseded all personal affection, Philip summoned one of his most trusted private secretaries to his study. Behind closed doors, operating within the strict confidentiality of his private papers, he dictated the foundational clauses of what would become the secret decree. No consort outside the direct line of succession, he explicitly commanded, could ever be permitted to displace, diminish, override, or place conditions upon the residential and constitutional standing of an heir to the throne. He carefully defined a royal consort as a spouse possessing great ceremonial power and public respect, yet remaining fundamentally outside the unbroken bloodline that inherits the crown itself. What began as a localized disagreement over a single apartment suite had Windsor expanded rapidly under his relentless hand into an absolute ironclad restriction covering every principal crown residence across the United Kingdom. And Philip didn't stop there. He confronted Charles directly in a recorded private exchange, demanding to know whether his son would have the political strength and moral courage to protect William's household and future inheritance if Camilla ever demanded greater residential and administrative control once they occupied the throne. Charles answered that once he became king, he could not allow old family fears and historic paranoia to govern the daily reality of his marriage. But beneath those diplomatic words, Philip heard something chilling and entirely unacceptable. The unmistakable admission that personal romantic devotion might ultimately override constitutional duty when pressure mounted behind palace walls. Realizing that his son's judgment was fatally compromised by a lifetime of emotional devotion, Philip took matters into his own hands. Before dawn broke over the Berkshire countryside, he widened the geographic and administrative scope of the restriction, transforming a targeted memo into a comprehensive decree that encompassed every major royal residence. He established an unbreakable chain of legal guardians, binding administrative protocols, and rigorous succession safeguards designed to withstand intense personal pressure, political lobbying, and emotional manipulation, even if those pressures were applied by a reigning monarch at the height of his power. So when we jump forward to that meeting at Windsor Castle where the decree is finally activated, the true weight of what Philip built becomes impossible to ignore. Princess Anne enters the room without knocking, without offering any polite greeting to acknowledge the tense atmosphere. She walks directly to the polished mahogany table and places a heavy black archival case squarely in the center, keeping one hand resting firmly on its leather lid. That singular gesture communicates more than any spoken threat ever could. The documents inside are not theoretical arguments or distant memories. They are active, legally binding instruments of statecraft. And Anne is standing there as one of the designated enforcers of an institutional mandate that cannot be bypassed, negotiated, or dissolved by royal decree. Camilla immediately directs her sharpest gaze toward the princess, her voice carrying fragments of wounded authority as she declares that the decree is fundamentally unjust and will inevitably be overturned through the formal channels of the Royal Household Property Council. Anne doesn't raise her voice or engage in heated debate with chilling calmness. She simply states that her father anticipated those exact words long before his passing and meticulously prepared every single legal safeguard to withstand any challenge Camilla could possibly mount. She explains that before Philip died, she accepted the solemn burden of acting as the primary guardian of the decree. It's not a privilege or a ceremonial title. It's an unbreakable constitutional duty entrusted to her to ensure that affection, political pressure, and private domestic bargaining can never weaken the protective framework surrounding the direct line of succession. And then the second shockwave hits and reaches into the black archival case and withdraws a second set of documents revealing the precise mechanisms that bind the future of the monarchy. Beneath Anne's signature on the foundational guardianship papers rests the signature of Prince William. The future king is not merely an observer invited to witness a family dispute or offer sympathetic counsel. He has been placed directly inside the administrative machinery of enforcement. His explicit written signature is legally required before Camilla can receive even a single permanent private suite, administrative office, or residential foothold inside any principal crown property across the realm. The implications are staggering. William looks across the table toward his father, but Charles can offer no comfort because the monarch instantly understands that his own son has been positioned as an unmovable shield, protecting the long-term integrity of the crown against the personal ambitions of the reigning consort. Camilla hastily turns the pages of the supporting schedules, frantically searching through dense legal clauses and administrative addendums for a single procedural loophole or structural weakness that could invalidate the restrictions. Instead of finding a way out, she discovers something far more devastating. Across multiple protected residential clauses throughout the national portfolio, the name of Catherine, Princess of Wales, is repeated with absolute strategic precision. The emerging pattern is impossible to ignore or misinterpret. Philip's decree was never drafted merely as a defensive measure to keep one specific woman out of a set of historic bedrooms. It was engineered with surgical foresight to secure Catherine's residential future, institutional authority, and physical security years before anyone could mount a successful challenge against her. The deeper reasons connect directly back to the unspoken fallout from that bitter evening at Windsor, when Catherine moved her chair a fraction of an inch, and Philip saw the entire future flash before his eyes. The realization triggers a profound psychological shift inside the room. Camilla understands with blinding clarity that her decades of enduring public hostility, managing media scandals, and fighting for social acceptance have culminated in a bitter irony. She reached the highest ceremonial peak of the British monarchy alongside the man she loves, only to find that another woman's future security has been meticulously guaranteed by permanently capping her own sphere of influence. The physical space around her suddenly feels smaller, defined entirely by invisible lines drawn by a man who refused to trust her intentions. Every corridor of Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace now stands as a physical monument to her limitation. She can wear the crown upon her head during national pageants, but she will forever remain locked out of the administrative rooms where the true operational power of the state is exercised on a daily basis. When Camilla accuses Anne and William of weaponizing a dead man's lingering fears to humiliate her publicly and diminish her standing within the family, William answers with a steady, unshakable calmness that strikes harder than any outburst of rage. He states plainly that his grandfather's strict precautions exist precisely because the dangers of unchecked domestic influence have been ignored for far too long in the past. He's not acting out of personal malice or petty vengeance for past hurts. He's placing the long-term inheritance and stability of the entire nation far above the fleeting emotional comfort of the present moment. His voice remains entirely level, embodying the heavy burden of a future sovereign who knows that surrendering even an inch of these foundational protections would open the floodgates for future generations to dismantle the monarchy from within. Anne reinforces her nephew's position by unfolding the final section of Philip's documented personal archives, revealing a dormant succession schedule that has quietly awaited the exact moment of political transition. The schedule dictates that once the heir apparent assumes expanded constitutional duties, a prearranged operational framework will automatically trigger securing permanent residential priorities, dedicated staff access, and administrative control at Windsor Castle and Buckingham Palace for William and Catherine, entirely independent of the reigning queen's personal wishes or executive approval. The silence that follows this final revelation is absolute. Camilla understands, without a single word needing to be spoken, that every avenue of escape has been systematically sealed off. Philip didn't simply build a temporary wall to keep her out of a few royal apartments. He constructed an enduring architectural and legal fortress around Catherine's future, ensuring that the next generation of leadership would step into their historical roles without ever having to beg for permission from a royal consort whose tenure is bound by time. By sunrise, the news escapes the confines of Windsor Castle and spills into the public sphere, transforming a private family dispute into an explosive national spectacle. Newspaper headlines across the nation featured darkened images of the heavy iron gates of Windsor beneath piercing titles declaring that the Queen can visit as a temporary guest, but can never truly rule the rooms where history is shaped. Commentators across every major broadcasting network analyzed the unprecedented situation, dissecting the delicate legal distinction between personal royal property held by individual family members and official crown residences preserved for the long-term continuity of the state. Viewers across the country quickly realized that the fierce debate unfolding before their eyes is not about antique furniture, luxury bedrooms, or misplaced sets of keys. It's a profound constitutional question concerning whether personal romantic devotion can ever legally outweigh institutional inheritance within an ancient monarchy, built to outlive every single individual who wears its crown. Inside the private quarters of the palace, King Charles sits in absolute stillness as television broadcasts detail the catastrophic fallout of his father's final decree. Palace communications officially confirms that Queen Camilla will retain her majestic title, her public standing, and her essential ceremonial duties representing the nation during state occasions. However, she will hold no independent permanent authority, no administrative control, and no executive power inside the principal crown of states, where the daily work of the monarchy is organized behind closed doors. The king understands the brutal reality of the public verdict. If he chooses to launch a full-scale political and legal battle to overturn his father's decree, it will appear to the entire nation that his private marriage matters more to him than the structural stability of the succession itself. That risk is simply too high for the monarchy to survive unscathed, forcing the sovereign into a position of painful capitulation, where he must watch his wife bear the full weight of institutional rejection. But then something unexpected happens that changes the emotional trajectory of the entire crisis. Princess Catherine requests an entirely private meeting with Queen Camilla, completely bypassing their respective private secretaries, legal advisors, and royal aides. No cameras, no recording devices, no protective guardians waiting outside the door to intervene. Two women whose lives have been defined and constrained by the exact same institution in radically different ways sit opposite one another behind a closed door. One woman spent decades fighting a grueling uphill battle against public hostility to reach the absolute center of royal power. The other was systematically shielded from that very fight by a secretive legal decree she never personally requested. What follows is not a triumphant victory speech or an arrogant display of power. It's a raw, unfiltered admission that lays bare the deep emotional cost of Philip's final directive. Catherine opens the conversation by acknowledging the profound tension that threatens to fracture the reigning monarch's household from the future king's administration. She explains that she requested the private audience because she can clearly foresee how the decree might be weaponized by external commentators to turn every future royal appearance into a silent, bitter contest between two women vying for symbolic dominance. Her protected residential position grants her priority inside key crown properties, but she harbors no desire to create the public impression that she has forcefully seized rooms, staff, or administrative authority away from the reigning queen. She understands intimately that even a complete legal and constitutional victory can inflict wounds so deep and personal that they permanently score the family dynamic for generations to come. The future of the crown depends entirely on maintaining a fragile semblance of unity. making a private understanding an absolute necessity before public hostility spirals completely out of control. Camilla absorbs the explanation with a carefully controlled exterior, though the pain of her marginalized position remains unmistakable in her eyes. She confronts Catherine directly, questioning why she remained completely silent for so long while protective legal walls were quietly being constructed around her. The Queen Consort voices the heavy burden of her years of dedicated service, noting the immense anger she has endured and the countless times she has been forced to prove her loyalty to an unforgiving public, only to discover that another woman's future security has been permanently guaranteed by systematically capping her own sphere of influence. Catherine listens without a single interruption, absorbing the raw bitterness of the accusation. When Camilla finishes speaking, the younger princess responds by recalling that fateful evening at the Windsor dinner table when the historic apartment suite was casually dismissed as unnecessary territory. She explains that her silence was never born of malice, but of a profound overriding fear that her own children's security and rightful place within the dynasty might one day be left entirely dependent upon the shifting personal approval of a royal consort rather than established constitutional duty. To bridge the dangerous chasm between them, Catherine offers a pragmatic and sensitive compromise designed to restore a measure of dignity to the defeated queen. She promises to fully support the establishment of a permanent, highly secure private sanctuary for Camilla, located at one of the personal properties owned directly by King Charles rather than the state. This private residence would be completely isolated from the toxic household politics, administrative interference, and legal restrictions imposed by Philip's decree, ensuring that no institutional guardian can ever strip Camilla of her home. Camilla listens closely to the proposal, recognizing the olive branch being extended across the generational divide. She does not instantly forgive the decree, nor does she pretend the crushing disappointment has magically vanished from her heart, but she makes the pragmatic decision to stop demanding the impossible. She agrees to assist in shaping a carefully worded public statement that will prevent the family conflict from escalating into an all-out institutional war that would destroy them all. The private truce arrives none too soon. By the following morning, crowds have gathered behind the iron railings of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle, leaving floral tributes, photographs of the late Duke of Edinburgh, and notes praising his steadfast foresight in protecting the future of the nation. When Catherine and Camilla make a joint, highly publicized appearance together at a scheduled royal engagement later that week, the absolute silence they maintain regarding the decree speaks volumes to the watching world. Neither woman utters a single word about the secret documents or the fierce battles fought behind closed doors. Their calm, unified presence delivers an unmistakable message that the royal family has consciously chosen controlled dignity over destructive revenge. The heavy wooden doors of Windsor Castle close with a quiet, resonant thud that echoes through the empty stone corridors. Queen Camilla stands alone beside the polished mahogany table, her fingers resting lightly upon the final set of keys she once believed would unlock her permanent domain. There were no cameras rolling, no private secretaries whispering hurried updates, and no dramatic confrontations left to fight. The storm that shook the very foundations of the House of Windsor has finally subsided into a profound, unalterable silence. She reaches down, lifts the cold metal ring, and makes the deliberate choice to return the keys herself, rather than wait for an official collection that would only deepen her humiliation. Princess Anne receives them without a hint of triumph or satisfaction, her expression remaining as steadfast and unyielding as the stone walls surrounding them. In that quiet exchange between two women who have fought for the crown from entirely opposite directions, no apologies are offered and none are demanded. The boundaries of the institution have held firm against the tide of personal ambition. Moments later, Prince William steps forward to offer a final measured assurance, promising that the decree will never be weaponized to strip away her public dignity, diminish her ceremonial responsibilities, or actively turn the royal family against her during state events. In return, the Queen understands that her grand vision of establishing an independent network of administrative power and permanent residential control across every major crown estate is entirely over. The defeat is personal, structural, and absolute. Yet, the true meaning of the crisis is no longer found in what she has permanently lost. It is revealed entirely in the quiet, agonizing choice she makes afterward, whether to let bitterness consume her remaining years or accept that serving an ancient monarchy sometimes demands the surrender of the very privileges one believed were guaranteed by love. The restrictions imposed by Prince Philip will remain completely untouched, ensuring she can visit palaces only when duty calls and must depart without leaving any lasting administrative authority behind. King Charles retreats alongside his wife to a secluded private residence held under his own personal control. Far away from the rigid oversight of the crown estates and the watchful eyes of institutional guardians within the walls of that personal sanctuary, their marriage no longer has to answer to succession schedules, legal decrees, or the watchful permission of future generations. It is not the sweeping victory Camilla originally fought for across decades of public scandal, but it provides them with something far more enduring than palaces of stone can ever replicate: a sanctuary where love does not have to beg for a place to belong. As the sun sets over the quiet English countryside, casting long shadows across the magnificent gates of Windsor and Buckingham Palace, the nation outside continues its endless debates about duty versus devotion. Yet inside the royal household, a new chapter has quietly begun, anchored forever by the unbreakable law.